In the third week of October in 1880, a homesteader named Alden Merrick set a 40-gallon cast iron kettle down in the middle of the floor of his sod house on the chalk bluffs above the Missouri River in Bon Homme County, Dakota Territory. Then he stopped. He cut no hole in his roof, he ran no stovepipe, hung no flue, laid up no chimney of brick or of stone. There was nothing above that kettle but the cottonwood ceiling poles, 2 feet of prairie sod, and the sky beyond it, and there never would be. Alden Merrick had built a stove that could not be lit, and he had built it that way on purpose. Down in the cellar he had cut into the soft white rock beneath the house. 11 sealed oak barrels stood on a plank rack, each holding 180 pounds of a pale, dry, crumbling stone dust that would not burn. It would not burn because it had already finished burning 3 months earlier in a pit he had dug into the side of his own bluff. Within 6 months, that kettle would be the only heat on the bluff that a blizzard could not reach. Merrick was 41 years old that autumn, and he had come to Dakota Territory from Rockland, Maine, which in the middle of the 19th century was not a fishing town first, but a lime town. The limestone under Knox County was some of the purest on the eastern seaboard, and kilns stood in ranks along the Rockland waterfront burning day and night. Sending burnt lime out by schooner to plaster and mortar half the cities of the Atlantic coast. He went into those kilns at 11 as a barrel boy and was a burner by 20. The man who judged when a kiln was finished by the color of the flame and the settling of the charge. He knew quicklime the way a miller knows flour. And he knew that once it came out, it was not a stone at all, but something restless and unfinished, a rock with a hole knocked in it, waiting. He knew what it did to men. He had watched a burner take a face full of steam off a wetted charge and lose the sight of an eye inside a week, and he carried the marks himself, the backs of both hands mottled pale where lime dust had found the sweat under his cuffs and eaten in. And he knew the ships. Rockland's lime schooners carried the most feared cargo on the coast. Because if a coaster took water in a gale, the cargo did not spoil. It began to heat in the dark inside a sealed hold with no flame and no smoke, and it would char the ship's own timbers and light them from the inside. The rule the Rockland masters lived by was absolute. If your lime takes water, do not open the hatches. Caulk every seam and starve it. A lime fire in an airtight hold will smolder for days and go out. Open the hatch to look at it, and you lose the vessel in 20 minutes. That was the education Alden Merrick brought west. He did not think of quicklime as building material. He thought of it as a fire that had been folded up and put away in a barrel. He filed on a quarter section above the Missouri in 1878, a few miles upriver from the steamboat landing at Bon Homme. He came for land, like everyone else. What saved his family 3 winters later was what he found in the face of the bluff. But before the rock there was the problem, and the problem on the Dakota prairie was fuel. The eastern settler arrived with an idea of winter that was fundamentally wrong. In Maine or Ohio, winter was cold and there was a woodlot, and the woodlot grew back. On the open Dakota grassland, there was no woodlot, only narrow ribbons of cottonwood and box elder down in the river breaks, and every claim within reach of them had been stripped inside 3 years. So the plains ran on imported fuel. Coal came up the Missouri by steamboat in the open season and out along the new rail lines in the cold one, and a settler laid in what he could afford in October and prayed the trains kept running. When they did not, people burned corn, fence rails, furniture, and prairie hay twisted into hard, dense sticks that gave out in 3 or 4 minutes apiece. Merrick watched 2 winters of it and saw what everyone saw, which was that people ran out of fuel. But he was a kiln man, and he saw the second thing, which almost nobody talked about and which killed just as many. A fire needs air, and it needs a great deal of it. Burning 1 pound of wood properly takes something like 15 pounds of air, drawn in through the walls of the house and pushed out the chimney. A house with a stove in it is not a sealed box. It is a chimney with rooms attached, flushed all winter with cold outside air that the fire then has to heat. And when a blizzard drifts a roof over and packs wet snow into a stovepipe, the fire does not simply go out. It goes lazy. Starved of draft, wood stops burning to carbon dioxide and starts making carbon monoxide instead, which has no smell, and which a person will breathe until they get sleepy and warm and stop. Every hard Dakota winter produced a few houses found in the spring with everyone still in bed. Merrick did that accounting, and it came out ugly. The heat source that keeps a family alive also eats their air, requires an open hole in the roof, must be fed by a man who goes outside, and fails precisely when the weather is bad enough to kill. That is a machine that breaks at the worst possible moment by design. What he wanted was heat that did not need a fire. The bluff behind his claim gave him the other half of it. The Missouri cuts through a formation of soft white chalk in that part of the territory, and where the river has undercut the bluffs it stands, exposed in clean white faces 40 and 50 feet high. It is soft enough to saw fresh out of the ground, and it hardens in the air, and settlers around Yankton quarried it and built with it. Merrick looked at it and saw the Rockland shore. Because chalk is calcium carbonate, and calcium carbonate is the raw material of quicklime. And Alden Merrick had been turning one into the other since he was 11 years old. The chemistry is old and completely reliable. Heat limestone above 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit and hold it there, and the carbon dioxide locked in the stone is driven off as gas. What is left is calcium oxide, quicklime. 100 pounds of clean chalk yields 56 pounds of quicklime and 44 pounds of gas that goes up the kiln and away on the wind. The stone loses nearly half its weight and gains a violent appetite, because quicklime wants its partner back. Give it water, and it takes it immediately and completely and becomes calcium hydroxide, slaked lime, the white paste used for whitewash and mortar for 4,000 years. And that reaction gives out heat, a great deal of it, all at once, with no flame anywhere in it. Merrick had felt it 100 times without ever writing a number down, and on the Dakota bluff he measured it properly with a borrowed dairy thermometer and a bucket, because he wanted something he could plan around. What he arrived at was this: 3 pounds of good quicklime dropped into 1 gallon of creek water would carry that gallon from ice cold to a hard rolling boil. 3 pounds of stone, 1 gallon of water, no fire. He wrote it on a slate, hung the slate on a nail, and never took it down. Now, 1 hundredweight of quicklime holds about as much heat as 7 pounds of dry oak. That is the honest figure, and Merrick never once pretended otherwise. As a fuel measured by the pound, quicklime is contemptible. Wood beats it 14 to 1. But that was not the comparison that mattered, and this is where Merrick was cleverer than every man who laughed at him. The pit kiln he dug into the bluff that first summer would eat anything. Green cottonwood too wet to burn in a stove. Driftwood hauled soaking off the Missouri sandbars, prairie hay, corn stalks, buffalo chips, rotten fence posts, all the fuel that lay around a Dakota claim in July in useless abundance and was worth nothing in January, because by then it would have rotted, or soaked, or blown away, or lain buried under 6 feet of drift 100 yards from the door. The kiln converted about a third of that heat into a mineral. Not a good conversion, and he knew it. But the mineral did not rot, did not soak, did not blow away. It sat in a barrel and lost nothing, and it gave its heat back the moment he asked, with no flame, no smoke, no draft, no chimney, and without taking one breath of air from the room. He was not trying to beat firewood. He was trying to store August somewhere that January could not get at it. He built the kiln in June of 1879 into the slope where the bluff turned, so 3 sides were solid ground. It was a pot kiln of the oldest kind, a shaft 8 feet deep and 5 feet across at the mouth, narrowing to 3 at the bottom, lined with fieldstone laid dry and daubed with clay, with a low-draw arch at the foot for the fire and for raking out. He charged it in layers, a foot of broken chalk in pieces no bigger than his fist, then a bed of fuel, then chalk again, up to the rim. Then he burned it for 3 days and 3 nights, and the burning was the whole art. Too cool in the middle of the charge never calcines, and you draw out lumps of raw stone with a thin skin of lime around them. Too hot, and the lime overburns, glazes, shrinks and goes dead a different way, and will hardly slake at all afterward. Merrick judged it by color through the draw arch and by the settling of the charge, and he slept very little for those 3 days, and his daughter Ivy carried his meals up to the kiln head. What came out 2 days later was lighter than what went in, pale as bone, and so hungry it would pull moisture out of the air on a humid morning and start crumbling in the barrel. Storage was the part he took most seriously, because quicklime left in open air slowly takes up moisture and carbon dioxide and goes quietly dead. Burners call it air slaking. Nothing hisses. The lump simply falls apart into a soft, useless meal over a few months. And there is no way to tell by looking. So Merrick packed his lime hot from the kiln into charred oak barrels, drove the heads home, ran melted pitch and tallow around every seam, pasted paper over that, and stacked them on a plank rack a foot clear of the floor in the dry chamber he had cut back into the chalk. He did not open one until he needed it. The kettle came off a wrecked steamboat at the landing, a 40-gallon cast iron sugar kettle 30 inches across the mouth, and he paid $4 for it. He set it on 3 fire-brick piers in a shallow sand pit in the middle of the winter room, so that no part of it touched wood. The winter room itself was nothing special, and Merrick was insistent about that. It was a plank-lined chamber 8 feet by 10 inside his ordinary sod house with a low rope bed, a table and shelves. Small on purpose because a small room is a cheap room to heat, and tight on purpose because a heat source that needs no chimney lets you seal a house in a way a stove never will. Onto the kettle he fitted a heavy iron lid clamped down by 4 wedges over a tarred rope gasket. Through the lid went 3 things: a copper drip tube from a small water keg on a shelf, controlled by a wooden plug tap he could turn a quarter turn at a time, a plug charging port so lime could go in without unclamping, and a vapor pipe, the piece his neighbors understood least and which mattered most. That vapor pipe ran down into a coiled length of copper inside an open barrel of water in the corner. Slaking makes steam, and steam is where the heat runs away. Every pound of steam that escapes a house carries off more heat than 2 pounds of quicklime produce, and Merrick had watched lime men waste half a charge that way in Rockland without ever knowing it, so he did not let the steam leave. He piped it into cold water where it condensed and gave up everything it had, and the water ran back down to be used again. Around the kettle he set a riveted sheet iron shroud, standing 4 inches off the iron on short legs, open top and bottom. It kept a child's hand off a surface that ran near boiling, and it turned the kettle into a chimney of its own, drawing cool floor air up past the hot metal and pouring warm air out of the top in a steady column. The last piece was a 2-inch auger hole through the door frame with a wooden slide over it. That was the whole of his ventilation, and it was enough, because 4 people breathing need perhaps a 20th of the air a working stove needs. Merrick could seal that house until it whistled and still keep his family in good air, and no stove on the plains could make that claim. He finished in September of 1880. He had 11 barrels down, close to a ton of quicklime, and he reckoned on 100 pounds a day to hold the winter room at 50 degrees in a hard blow. 20 days of siege. He thought 20 days was generous. The valley thought he had lost his mind. The trouble was that the mockery was not stupid. Milo Haig, who kept the store at the landing, worked out the arithmetic in front of 6 men one afternoon and got it exactly right. He asked Merrick what 100 pounds of lime was worth in firewood, and Merrick, who never lied about it, told him about 7 pounds of dry oak. Haig said that a full barrel was therefore worth an armload of stovewood, and that Merrick had spent a whole summer, a kiln, 4 cords of driftwood, and the skin off his hands to lay in 11 armloads. Every number in that was correct, and Merrick did not argue with it. He said only that an armload of stovewood is no use to a man who cannot reach the woodpile, that his lime never required him to go outside, and that no chimney means no chimney to block. Haig said a man afraid of a chimney had no business on the plains. The name stuck anyway. They called the place the Whitewash House. A Norwegian named Torvald Aseth, who had the claim 4 miles east and was kinder about it than most, said gently that Merrick had laid in 11 barrels of mortar and no bricks. The first proof came earlier than anyone expected. On the 15th of October, 1880, an out-of-season blizzard came down across Dakota Territory that had no business existing. Snow fell for a day and a night, drifting to the eaves, with stock still out on grass and half the country's fuel still unhauled. It was the opening of what would be remembered as the hard winter, or the snow winter. Merrick's stovepipe packed with snow on the first night. He did not clear it. He shut the stove, sealed the door of the winter room, cracked the auger hole a finger's width, and charged the kettle with 30 pounds of quicklime out of the first barrel. Then he opened the drip tap a quarter turn. Nothing happened for a minute and a half. Then the kettle began to speak, a dry ticking first as the lumps split and fell apart, then a hiss that rose steadily until the shroud was humming with it, and the iron went from cold to too hot to touch in under 4 minutes. The vapor pipe knocked and started running condensate into the barrel. The room came up 11 degrees in the first hour. Ivy Merrick, who was 9, sat on the bed with her feet off the floor and watched a kettle with no fire under it boil the frost out of the air. There was no smoke, no flame, no light from it at all, only heat coming off black iron in the middle of the room. They rode out the October storm at 54 degrees on 90 pounds of stone. Then the winter proper arrived, and it was worse than anything the territory had on record. The hard winter of 1880 and 1881 did not have one great storm in it. It had a great many, arriving every few days from October into April, each packing the last one harder. Cuts in the rail lines filled 20 feet deep and froze solid, so that a plow clearing them in the morning found them full again by dark. The railroads fought it until February and then gave up, and the settlements east of the Missouri sat without a train, without coal, and without mail for months. Seed grain went into the stoves, and the cattle losses across the northern range that year were counted in tens of thousands of head. On the bluff, the Merricks lived a different winter. In the long, cold spells between storms, they used the stove like everyone else, because the stove was cheap and the lime was not. When the wind came up and the pipe drifted over, Merrick shut the stove, sealed the room, and charged the kettle, and the house simply carried on. He kept the slate on the nail and ticked off every charge in chalk. By the 4th of January, he had burned 2 barrels and part of a third, and he was well inside his own reckoning. On the 6th of January, he broke the seal on the 4th barrel, and the winter turned. The lime looked right. Pale, dry, light in the hand, crumbling at the edges the way it should. He shoveled 30 pounds into the kettle, clamped down, opened the tap a quarter turn, and waited for the ticking. It did not come. 2 minutes. 4. He opened the tap further. The kettle warmed a little, the way a kettle warms when you pour warm water into it, and then it stopped warming, and the room began to lose the heat it had. He unclamped the lid and looked into a mass of gray soup that had never boiled and never would. Merrick went down with a lantern and a tin cup and tested every barrel he had. The test takes 10 seconds, and any burner knows it. Drop 1 lump into cold water, live lime cracks, hisses, throws steam, and falls apart into milk inside half a minute. Dead lime sits on the bottom of the cup and does nothing at all. Barrel 5, dead. Barrel 6, dead. Barrels 7 and 8, dead. Barrel 9, live. Barrels 10 and 11, live. 5 of his 11 barrels would not slake, and he had eaten 3 already. In the first week of January, with the worst 3 months of the worst winter on record still ahead of him, Alden Merrick had 3 live barrels and about 540 pounds of usable lime where he had planned on a ton. The first thing he thought was that the seals had failed and the barrels had air slaked. He checked them against that, and it did not hold. Air-slaked lime gains weight because it takes water and gas into itself, and a burner can catch it on a steelyard. Merrick hung every barrel and weighed it. The dead ones weighed exactly what they had weighed in August. Whatever was wrong with them had been wrong before they were ever sealed, which meant it had been wrong when they came out of the kiln, which meant it had been wrong in the rock. He sat with that for a day, then went out to the bluff with a bar and a lantern in the middle of a Dakota January and looked at the face he had quarried. He had worked that face all summer, and by August he was pulling stone from higher up. 9 feet above his original floor there was a band in the chalk, perhaps 2 feet thick, a shade grayer than the clean white below it, slightly heavier and slightly greasy under the thumb. He had noticed it in August and thought nothing of it. It broke well, and it was closer to hand. That band was the answer, and it is a piece of chemistry that had been catching lime burners out for centuries. Clean chalk is nearly pure calcium carbonate and burns to a fat, hungry quicklime that slakes violently and gives up its full heat. But limestone with clay in it behaves completely differently in the kiln. At burning temperature, the silica and alumina in the clay do not sit idle. They combine chemically with the lime as it forms, locking a large fraction of the calcium into hard silicates instead of leaving it as free calcium oxide. What comes out is hydraulic lime, and hydraulic lime is a superb material. It sets hard under water, which fat lime will not, and it was what men built harbor walls and cisterns from. But it slakes feebly because most of its calcium is already committed. Put it in water and it does not roar. It sighs. Merrick had spent the last 3 weeks of August burning the gray band because it was easier to reach, and had barreled 500 pounds of the finest cistern mortar in Bon Homme County under the honest belief that it was fuel. The barrels were correctly sealed, correctly stored, correctly weighed. They were simply the wrong rock. And the difference had been visible only as a slight grayness in a quarry face he had stopped looking at in July. The cup test would have caught it in 10 seconds. He had run the cup test on the first barrel and on none of the others because he had burned lime for 30 years and had never once needed to. 3 barrels, 540 pounds. At 100 pounds a day of siege, that was 5 days, and there were 90 days of winter left. So Merrick went at it the only way left to him, which was to stop wasting what he had. Looked at honestly, his machine had been throwing away a great deal. The first waste was the spent charge. All autumn he had raked the exhausted lime paste out of the kettle and dumped it in the snow outside. But 100 pounds of spent charge comes out at something close to boiling, and it holds a real quantity of ordinary heat on its way back down to room temperature. Merrick built a shallow sheet iron drawer that slid under the rope bed and raked every spent charge into that instead. The paste went on giving heat under the bed for 6 or 7 hours after the reaction had finished. He judged it worth about 1/6 of the whole charge, and 1/6 of everything he had left was 15 days. The second waste was steam, and it was much larger. He had been opening the drip tap too far. A flood of water hits a charge, the whole thing goes off at once, and a slug of steam blasts up the vapor pipe faster than the condenser can take it. So a good part of it forces past the rope gasket and out of the house. Merrick throttled the tap to a bare weep and made each charge run 2 hours instead of 10 minutes. The reaction stayed hot, the steam came off slowly enough for the coil to catch all of it, and the condensate came back to the keg to be used again. The third change was the one nobody expected, and it came from the dead barrels. Hydraulic lime is worthless as fuel and magnificent as mortar, and unlike ordinary lime, it sets in cold, damp, sunless conditions, which is precisely what a sealed sod house in January is. Merrick slaked a dead barrel to a stiff putty with warm condensate, and over 3 days he and Nell skimmed the entire inside of the winter room with it, every plank seam, every knothole. The joint where the lining met the sod, around the door frame, around the auger hole, and a 1/4 inch over the ceiling boards. He was sealing the house against the wind. A sod house leaks air through 100 small paths, and every cubic foot of cold air that finds its way in has to be heated. On a windy night, that infiltration is a serious fraction of the whole heat load. And it is the one loss a man can attack with a trowel and no fuel at all. When they were done, the room smelled of wet lime for a week, and the candle flame by the door, which had leaned all winter, stood straight up. His consumption fell from 100 pounds a day to 62. The fuel he had thrown away in ignorance had come back as the thing that made the rest of it last. The winter tested every bit of it in February. On the 8th, snowmelt found a crack in the chalk above the cellar rack and a barrel took water, and by evening the cellar was full of a hot chemical stink and a haze of steam, and one barrel head was scorched brown and smoking. Nell went for the door to let air in. Merrick caught her arm. This was Rockland. This was the schooner rule, and he had been waiting 20 years to need it. A lime fire feeds on air like any other fire, and a lime fire in a confined space with the air shut off will heat and char and smolder and die. Give it draft, and it will take the timber and then the house. Merrick shoved every rag they owned into the hatch seam, mortared the edge with dead lime putty, weighted the hatch with the anvil, and left it shut for 2 full days. When he opened it, there was a barrel burned through, a scorched plank, a foot of white paste on the floor, and no fire. He had lost the barrel and kept the house. 9 days later, the Asseths came. Torvald had been burning hay since the middle of January and had been down to green cottonwood for a week. And green cottonwood in a stove makes more creosote than heat. On the 17th of February, his stovepipe drifted over in the night. He woke with a headache that would not lift, found his wife Carrie very hard to wake, and his youngest child harder, and had the sense left to understand what that meant. Knock the pipe clear with a broom handle, and put the whole family out into the storm porch in the cold air until their heads cleared. Then he built a box on a hand sled, lined it with hay and quilts, put 3 children in it, and walked 4 miles into a north wind to the whitewash house. Merrick opened his door on a man carrying frost in his beard who could not immediately speak. What Asaph saw over Merrick's shoulder was a room at 51 degrees with the door sealed, no chimney, no stove going, and no smoke, and a black kettle in the middle of the floor, ticking and hissing to itself under a sheet iron shroud, with a girl reading beside it and a gray dog asleep against the warm sand of the pit. They stayed 19 days, 7 people in a room 8 feet by 10, with the auger hole open 2 fingers instead of 1. Asaph spent those days learning the whole of it, because he had just come very close to losing his family in bed, the burn, the color of a finished kiln, the cup test, the seal, the weight check on a steelyard, the slow tap, and the gray band in the rock. The 2 of them going out on a still day in early March to put a chalk line under the good stone. Milo Haig came up the track on the 24th of March when the drifts had settled enough to travel. He did not come to apologize. He came because the settlement had burned every stick it had, and he had heard there was a man on the bluff who could make heat out of rock. Merrick did not gloat. By every account, he simply took Haig down the cellar, handed him a tin cup of water and a lump out of barrel 11, and told him to drop it in and watch. Haig watched the lump crack and hiss and steam and fall to milk in half a minute in cold water with no fire in the building, and he was quiet for a while. Then he asked what it cost to build a kiln. The hard winter did not end cleanly. The Missouri had frozen deep, and the thaw came fast, and in the last days of March the ice broke and gorged in the channel and backed the river over its banks. The flood destroyed the town of Vermilion downriver from Bon Homme and swept steamboats out of the ice at Yankton and left them sitting in fields. The territory came out of that winter with its herds gone, its seed grain eaten and its towns half wrecked, and the first train reached some interior settlements on the 10th of May, 1881, having last run in the first week of January. Alden Merrick came out of it with 2 live barrels still on the rack, a burned patch on the cellar floor, a hydraulic lime skin on the inside of one small room, and 4 people and 1 dog who had not been cold. He built a bigger kiln that summer on the county road and burned for anybody who hauled fuel and stone to it. Torvald Aseth built the second. By the winter of 1883, there were 4 kilns on that stretch of the Missouri bluffs, and a standing local expression that a man ought to lay in his stove wood and his boiling stone both. And no settler within 11 miles sealed a barrel without weighing it and dropping a lump in a cup first. The kettle stayed in the middle of that sod house floor for 18 years, and it never once had a chimney over it. What Merrick had understood, and what the arithmetic at the store never touched, was that a fuel is not only a quantity of heat. It is a promise about when the heat will be there. Firewood makes a generous promise and breaks it exactly when the weather is trying to kill you, when the pile is buried, when the pipe is packed, when the draft dies and the smoke comes back into the room. Quicklime makes a much smaller promise and keeps it absolutely. It does not care about wind, it needs no hole in the roof, and it does not take one breath of air from a sleeping child. He had not invented heat. He had taken the fire out of a summer that would otherwise have been wasted, folded it into a dry white stone, sealed it in oak, and set it under his own floor to wait. And in the worst winter the northern plains ever recorded, on the days when every other fire in the valley failed for want of air, he went down the cellar steps with a lantern and brought August back up.